the contributions to the volume Empire, Nationalism, and War. That is part of the international project Russia's Great War and Revolution. And the contributions to this volume were discussed here in the framework of the conference, and we move to the final discussion. But before we do it, I would like to call on our wonderful team who helped us organize this conference. Olga. Yes. So students, though some of them deserted, Olga Shamina, Nadezhda Docenko. And our students, Natalia and Ivan, some of them are in our final paper, we are flattered. That's the final, concluding. We are flattered to have two commentators, Mark van Hagen, Arizona State University in the US, who is part of the editorial team of the volume Empire and Nationalism at War, and Boris Kalaninsky, the first pro-rector, vice-rector of the European University at St. Petersburg, professor of history at the European University of St. Petersburg, and the Institute of History of the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. There was a word out that the volume Empire, Nationalism, and War is the only volume who organized a conference workshop. I said it's not true. In fact, Boris represents another volume from the series Russia's Great War and Revolution, the volume that covers culture in the context of the revolution, and a similar conference occurred at the European University. And we're particularly happy to have Boris to comment in an editorial function, but also in a function of commentator on what transpired in the course of those 2 days here. So I suggest to start with the commentaries of Boris and then move to Mark. The floor is all yours.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's very nice for me to be here. I'm a person from the next volume. I'm a kind of neighbor, and I'm here. And I just wanted a very small remark, and Volodya had a chance to show me. Please look at the right corner below. International project, Russia's Great War and Evolution. So it's I would say it's a kind of hidden desire, something instead of something. Yeah. Yeah. Well, no. It's a very good. So it's an extremely difficult task to do comments for this conference. I would say practically impossible, right? And partially that is because papers are extremely interesting, and I want a lot of information because of this conference. But while speaking about conference, we always think about a possible volume, a possible book coming from this conference. So we can for sure say that it will be a book composed of interesting articles. But as you all know, there is a kind of difference between book of interesting articles and interesting collection of interesting articles. That's, I would say, interesting genre, and it's not always the same. And I think that it's an extremely ambitious task to write a very good introduction, which very often makes an interesting collection of articles. And we know that some such collections are famous for their great introduction. That's a challenge to write a good introduction as well as to make rather good comments for this conference, because articles and papers are absolutely different in terms of their genre, I would say. So what we have from this conference, what we have from this project or this stage. So we have several extremely interesting ideas, probably in a good sense of this award. we have interesting concepts that in the paper of Eric we have ideas of war nationalism and war nationality, which is a productive idea from my point of view. From Alexei's article, as far as I understand, that's the idea of recolonization, which is applied to the situation of the First World War, and that is really interesting. Josh gave us ideas of war of decolonizations, and that is also provocative ideas, and we all must think about it. The idea of imperial revolutions in Alexander's paper, it's also an important and interesting context. There are revolutions as complex of different revolutions and complexes of different complexes in different regions. That is also an extremely important idea in the paper of Marco Butina, and that is also a very fruitful approach from my point of view. But that's a huge task for introduction. How to combine these approaches? There are many different approaches in this book. It's not like some famous collection like inventing traditions. So we have general idea and some articles and papers that prove this. That's a different story. So how to structure this whole and how to organize it, that's a good challenge. There are some extremely interesting articles that bring ideas of context. For example, Yagerasov puts intellectual mobilization in Russia into international context. But I would say in some articles and some papers, I would like to have much more international context. And I think all articles could benefit in bringing to the general context of the First World War, comparing it to other imperial situation. And sometimes I missed war and I missed revolution in some papers. So an extremely interesting paper of Marina Magina, which is very juicy stuff, and it's absolutely great. But I think this paper could benefit if she would bring war experience of this war anthropologist and international context, how Russia was different. So actually, your answer, it would be good to bring your answers into the paper. In the paper of Sergei Glebov, I think it's an extremely interesting story of Eurasianism, and it's great, and he shows us pre-war context and influence of Kovalevsky for the story. But that it would be extremely interesting to have the impact of the war and the impact of revolution, not necessarily biographical, but intellectual and just contextual impact. I think it would be extremely important. While speaking about general composition, well, there could be complaints that you have some regions and you don't have other regions, but I don't think that is the greatest problem for this volume. As Ludmila told yesterday, the very idea of these geographical, I would say, collections within our project, the concept is different. So the idea of kaleidoscope volume is the idea of diversity, how different wars and revolutions were in different parts. I think here, and we have in some papers, that's a general view, and the view of comparison. So the very approach is different. So I wouldn't think that it's a shortcoming of the conference or of the volume that you wouldn't have some regions and some areas. But I think there should be a kind of balance between theoretical parts and geographical parts in this volume. And also, I think so, while speaking ideas, and ideas are central to most of papers, I would say. We can see it from perspective of people who produce ideas, or if I may say, who try to sell ideas, right?
but I would like to have much more about perception, right? So how ideas were sold and bought metaphorically and sometimes literally. So that's good. Ilya Gerasimov told in his paper that there was second edition of this collection of articles. So it means that it was sold to some extent, right? But it would be also great to know how many copies were sold. That matters also. And also, if it is possible, that's extremely huge idea, how these ideas were primitivized, I would say, put on the other level, on propaganda level of discussion. It would be also interesting. But sometimes this metaphor of the market, it could be absolutely literal, right? So revolution was sold, nationalism was sold. For example, let's give a primitive example. So at the end of 1914, at the beginning of 1915, Lviv was a huge tourist attraction for Russian people. People just rushed there. How Lviv was advertised at that time as a tourist, at the same time nationalist, if you like, and war propaganda attraction. So I think sometimes it could be evaluated just very simple in terms of figures. It's possible to do, I would think. Well, while speaking particular things, memory is extremely interesting, and this paper of Vera is great comparing Lithuanian, Polish, Russian perspectives. But it's also not just about memory, but about forgetting, right? Which is a part. So there are some things that the Russians would like to forget, but they are not allowed by the Poles to forget it. But at the same time, there are some things that the Poles would like to forget, and nobody reminds them. Right? Like, for example, we have a huge mutual history while thinking about possible influence, and it's quite impossible to imagine Russian revolutionary tradition without the Poles. We can't imagine Russian intelligentsia tradition without the Poles. Good or bad, that's our common history, right? Usually in Russia, we very often underestimate the huge Polish tradition. I'm not just speaking about my favorite songs, right? But like Song of Warsaw and other things. But just Polish impact is extremely huge in our radical tradition. That's our common heritage. We can't imagine 1905 without the Poles. Long live socialist independent Poland. That was the slogan of May of 1905 there. Nobody wants to remind Dzerzhinsky in Poland, right? Nobody wants to remind that there was thought as far as an ethnic group in Communist Party, it was the Poles. So in a sense, it wasn't just Russian revolution or Russian intervention brought to Poland. It was a kind of common imperial revolution, if you like, or something else. There are people who have much more elaborated ideas here in this audience how to put it. Anyway, it's like public history and memory is common, and sometimes forgetting is common, as we can see. The idea of war nationalism. I like this idea extremely. War nationalism. I would like to have maybe much more elaborated ideas, but I think so. But I think generally speaking, it's great in terms of actors, new actors, new tactics, new agents of nationalism. But I would think if you bring these terms, it brings another terms. So it's a kind of metaphorical terms which brings something necessary as well. So I would say we have war empire, something, war imperialism. But then I would say we have revolutionary nationalism, which a little bit different from. So we have also new language of nationalism as a result of revolution. I would say before February of 1917, because export of revolution was an extremely important theme of different actors during the time of the First World War. For example, the Germans, which was my favorite example, wanted to create a bold Islamic revolution. And newspaper they released for prisoners of war of Muslim confessions in Germany. I love the title of this newspaper, which was released in Russian, Turkish, Arabic, and Tatar. The name was Jihad. So they wanted to do jihad. They got nothing from it, but the idea of revolutionary nationalism, or in this case, not necessarily nationalism, but nationalism as well, it was before February. So, and in a sense, revolutionary constructed empires. That's the thing that language is extremely important. Well, revolution. So I love this approach, and as I had a chance to say that we historians of Russian Revolution absolutely underestimated the empire dimension of revolution. But even in this empire audience, I would say, we still have some ideas of, I would say, of old approaches. What are old approaches? To some extent, our view of revolution still, in a sense, is very much influenced by short course and books related to it. What I mean? Our vision of revolution still is very much Lenin-centric, Bolshevik-centric, and Petrograd-centric, right? So we have in a short course, we have in the book of Richard Pipes, which is anti-short course, and we have in a book of my friend Alain Defarges, which is anti-pipes. So we have the continuation. So, and sometimes we perceive the situation in empire as a reaction on Petrograd events. From my point of view, it's very pleasant for me as a person from this city to hear much more about Petrograd. But it's not the case. It's not the case. Gelsingfors was crucial, absolutely, right? And it could be confirmed by Lenin's writings. So the situation of Gelsingfors was taken in consideration many times while he made his political calculations. And Kiev was crucial, absolutely. Kiev was crucial for the situation, for the June crisis and events after this, for the general situation with empires, speaking about congresses, they convened the idea of federation, and so on. And it's interesting to see that in Kiev and in Helsinki, that very complicated situation of power, which is much more complicated than our primitive ideas of dual power, right? In both cases, we have at least triangles of power, or even something much more complicated. In case of Finland, which is extremely important, we have, I would say, the situation of double or even triple radicalization, right? So we have power of provisional government, we have different committees, we have the things, which actually is not that one action, because the civil war was also prepared, and these radicalizations, they supported each other. A very interesting process, I would say, which influenced the whole Russian empire situation. It wasn't just a local event, as well as Kiev situation. I think that implies the event. What else?
That's fine.
So, not much else to add. So, I would say, yes, I just want, about civil war, which is extremely important. There was a kind of discussion here about the whites and the reds, and this simplification of white-red perception of the civil war, which is much more complicated, and I absolutely buy these ideas. Recently, I had a chance to write a small popular article with the title "The Reds Against the Reds." So that is a very important dimension of the civil war, when some heroes of October attacked the Bolsheviks or Soviet government, or how you would say it. But that is a huge problem, that struggle of these dominant discourses of the whites and the reds, how they would absorb different local values and demands, and how local elites or local political actors could bring their own political agenda into these discourses of the reds and the whites. Maybe this idea is extremely primitive, but I think the reds would be much more successful in bringing and absorbing these local interests, and it was extremely important source of their victory. However, maybe I just don't know much about the empire politics of the whites, how they collaborated with local elites, how they constructed and tried to bring local ethnic groups under their flags. Well, I just want to end with my statement which I made at the beginning of my comment. So it's an extremely complicated task to write a good introduction for such a collection of articles, but nobody said that the task of composers of the volume is simple.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Reminds me, one word only reminds me that if empire is about anything, then it is about diversity. And we always stress that if you're writing about diversity, oh gee, that gives you a nightmare in terms of the narrativity and the composition and the very representation of how you represent it. So I take your comment then as a praise that we truly captured the empire, and that is exactly why the materials under one cover look, in different directions and do not cohere as easily as one would imagine. We pass then the country to Mark.
Okay. As usual, I have too many things to say, and I'm not sure what order to put them in to give them some priority. But one thing I want to start with, especially in light of last night's wonderful dinner, which some of you missed, but those of you who were there, we had lots of toasts, mostly from Sasha. And I think it's time to acknowledge Sasha's role in bringing us all together. It's not too often that I come to Russia these days, but when Sasha invited me, I wouldn't say no. And it's part because I think our relationship started when he took a course with Wortman and me at Columbia when he was still sort of from CEU via Rutgers. And I think this conference is an example, a case study of how far we've come since 1991 in creating an international scholarly community with new rules and new possibilities. And again, I like to call it the positive convergence between our two systems, because there's the bigger background of our relations, I think, internationally, are negative convergence. I mean, I don't see some belief last year or 2 years ago that Andrei Sakharov had this vision of positive convergence, that we would take the best from the Soviet welfare state and they would take the best from American democracy. I think I've come, living in Arizona, where we have a border that's got a wall on it, I now come to the conclusion that it's mostly about negative convergence. We've taken the worst from the Soviet Union, become more like the Soviet Union, I think, than we ever have been, whereas you've taken the worst from American capitalism and casino, vulgar capitalism, and your lives have been affected that way. But this is an example that if Sakharov were alive, I think she would say, this is positive convergence. And so I'd like to, and I'm having run a lot of these conferences in New York before I moved to Arizona, the Russian-Ukrainian one, that I did with Andreas Kapler and the Ukrainian gang. But before that, the Moscow, the Kazan, Moscow-Petersburg volume that came out of Kazan and has some sort of a genealogical connection to all of this too. I realize how hard it is to make this happen. And Sasha has done a brilliant job. So I think it's time to thank Sasha for bringing something to it. Thank you. And it's nice to have Ab Imperial here. I feel part of the Ab Imperial on stage before, so it's very nice to see so many people together. Actually, Josh and I think were maybe at the first World War I conference back in Philadelphia, with a strange group of fans of World War I, the Great War, as they call it. So it's nice to be here with people I've been talking to and writing to and and answering to for a long time. And the empire and region that Jane and Anatoly Grimyov also deserves to be remembered here, had similar problems of diversity and uneven contributions because of the nature of the material, which is the imperial diversity, which we wanted to capture and yet convey in some analytically rigorous, accessible to the reader, and also to make a contribution of bringing Russian history to European history above all, but world history more generally. And I think that's what we thought about with this project too, that World War I is still, despite all of our work so far, a Western Front-oriented story. It's still about Germany, France. And I just give you one recent example which confounds. I taught a book that many of you may know called Rite of Spring by Modris, who is a Latvian Canadian, I think, these days, but his family came from Latvia.
Modern six times.
Yes, Mother's Extant, right, Mother's, exactly. And the book opens, and from the title of Rite of Spring, with a description of the reception of Stravinsky's ballet in Paris, just before the war started. He wants to make out of this reception some statement about the aestheticization of violence that contributed to the Great War in total. He forgets about the Russian Revolution for the rest of the book, and as if there was no Russian front. It all goes back to the British and the French and the German experience. Even though he comes from Latvia, his family is a Latvian story that is entangled in the Eastern Front. You don't have to imagine. So it's an example of how even when people look like they're going to talk about our part of the war, they don't. And this Kramer book, by the way, which I keep on recommending to you, The Dynamics of Destruction, addresses Modris Eckstein's work almost at the beginning. He has a historiographical essay at the end of the book in which he addresses both that book and then another book which I want to talk about is Isabel Hull's book called Absolute Destruction, that brings us to the colonial war. She makes a case that Germany's experience in World War I, and probably beyond, was in large measure kind of following to some degree on Hannah Arendt's argument in totalitarianism, an importation of German colonial warfare, in this case Southwest Africa, to World War I. And Kramer takes this argument apart, I think very successfully. He says it's not about, and we had this debate about Kuropatkin being transferred from the German front to Central Asia to put down the 1916 revolt. So there is something that I think is worth talking about for those people who are interested in colonization, decolonization problem. Where does this war fit into the literature that we now have on colonial wars? And we started to talk about it today, but it's something I think would make this volume very appealing to people outside of the Russian East European field and help integrate us into the kind of things they talk about. And that's sort of the theme I want on a lot of these issues. Talking about, we've got a lot of binary oppositions that we are in the process of destroying here, or deconstructing. Red and white, and you talk about Dvoyevlastia. I will long start using the word Mnogovlastia to explain the revolution from 1970. Even in 1914, when you think Dvoyevlastia in some sense starts with martial law in the occupied area. You've got the military doing one thing, and the Gosudavsky Soviet and Petrograd sometimes objecting to them, but having really no power already. So there's already a kind of Dvoyevlastia that comes before 1917 in the wartime occupation policies, which I have to work on a bit more to make sure it makes sense. Another thing that occurred to me, and again, having worked with Hameson at Columbia, well, I've never been a student, I mean, not formally a student, but you can't work with Hameson without sort of being indoctrinated with his method, and Ilya knows that. A lot of the questions that Hampson in some sense pioneered like identity, revolution, the crisis of political parties. And he never talked about war until very late, as a rule, and kind of almost hesitated. Didn't want to talk about the war. He didn't really want to come to the World War I conference that we had at European University. He didn't want to talk about ethnicity for whatever strange reasons of his Russian, Jewish, Belgian background. But we are all coming back. But, you know, a lot of his students wrote about things that we are coming back to now in the context of war, empire, nation, and kind of giving a new spin to all of it. It's something that we might think about as we rewrite these articles too. Because he was trying to tie all this to European history as well. The whites have come up a lot, and I think there's even though we talked about the fact that we can't talk about red and white so simply anymore, we have kind of a big hole on the whites here. There's and the whites also had failed states a few times, and the whites had ideas about empire and nation, definitely, and those ideas sometimes overlapped with, reinforced people in Central Asia or Ukraine, but they more often went in opposition to this. And I think, especially coming out of Alexei's paper on the Kiev Club, that I think is one of his very important contributions to this whole volume, that there's something we need to do to maybe help overcome that gap between the right movement and the nationalist movements in places like Kiev and elsewhere, and the emergence of the whites, and the kind of transformation of the relationship between Russian nationalism and Ukrainian nationalism, or Finnish nationalism, or Baltic nationalism, the very same. So that's another area where I think we might be missing something. Related to that is the history of federalism. As you know, that's one of my things, history of federalism. And it's sort of in footnotes here and there. We have the Congress of Oppressed Peoples in Kiev in October of 1915. We have the Germans supporting all kinds of strange people in Switzerland, leagues of oppressed peoples who they are setting up to foment revolution in Russian empires in particular. Most of these people at some point have a kind of federalist program which eventually evolves into a more nationalist, independentist type of program. And that includes Siberians, Siberian regionalism starts as a federalist project and then becomes a Russian nationalist project, according to more recent scholarship. So there's this question of federalism, maybe tied to colonialism, is a kind of thorny set of issues that we haven't quite unpacked here yet, which so I'm not so worried as Boris says that we don't have encyclopedic coverage of the whole country and the whole empire and all empires, because I think that each one of these pieces pretty much is offering some very interesting revisionist argument that will make what we do, I think, appealing to, talking about selling, to our Europeanist colleagues, our global history colleagues who work on not just this war, but on empire nation in general. I just want to mention that you've already highlighted, Eric's talk about war nationalism and war nationality, Josh on the war as a decolonization war. I mentioned already Alexei and the Russian right in Kiev as again something kind of an unknown, although we should have known about it, an unknown thing. On Eurasianism, on the progressives, I mean, these are all new ways of looking at old questions, which I think, and many of them are sort of products of the cultural studies revolution in our field, which is okay. And it's about alternative visions of political space, it's about alternative visions of cultural identity, and that's running through a lot of these papers, is that kind of alternativeness of the war's history and what it opened up for and closed down about future development of the Russian Empire's space, however defined, but not just, but the space, the borderlands too, in between the empires. Sasha's international revolution concept that also is going to be something that people are going to talk about in future conferences, and even if they just don't agree in Jeremy's national governments, which I think again, no one's used it in that way that you are using it here, and it makes a lot of sense, and it explains a lot of things that whatever we used before wasn't helping us to do as well. One of the earlier things that I guess have been coming through, I did an article, which probably you may not know because it's in the Festschrift, on a Russian SR in Kiev, Konstantin Mikhailovich Beruchev, who was an officer. He retired from the Russian army before 1905 as a colonel. He'd been arrested and exiled several times for his revolutionary activities. Among other places, he was exiled in Turkestan. He claimed to be a Ukrainophile at the beginning of 1917. By summer of 1917, he was a Vrak Ukrainsk. He admitted that he was himself a Vrak Ukrainsk, but he certainly was the Ukrainian militants wanted him out of Kiev. First, he was appointed commissar to the southwestern, to the Kiev military district. Just as after he came back from exile, he'd been in exile in Switzerland, actually studying the militia army, which is something that very few people who advocated the militia army really ever did. And he studied the Swiss version of the militia army before he came back to, which is a normal thing for an SR to do, but very few SRs did this. So he comes back as commissar to the Kiev military district after Guchkov does his purge of the high command sometime in March, I think, or in April. Well, Beruchev puts on his uniform again and becomes commander of the Kiev military district. And in that capacity has to fight with the coalition of Polish legions, Czech legions, and Ukrainianization of the army, and he becomes his sort of class officer imperial identity squashes any sympathy he had for Ukraine by the middle of the summer. He talks about how before the war, he would go with his wife to some Shevchenko place and lay wreaths on the portrait of Shevchenko, and he thought of himself as a real Ukrainophile until he had to oversee this Ukrainization revolution, and he had to flee the city, and he used the excuse, because one of his topics was prisoners of war. He was asked to replace Breshkovskaya, who was the delegate of the provisional government to the peace talks on the prisoner of war exchanges in Copenhagen. So he fled Kiev for Copenhagen and did not come back to Bolshevik Russia because he, I think, knew what his fate would be. Ended up in New York, and that's what he wrote his memoir. So what I liked about the way he wrote it, he tried to explain from his position in Kiev. And again, he knew all the big boys and girls in the Russian SR party in Petrograd, and had worked with them and blown up things together, but he conveys this kind of sense of exasperation and frustration as the revolution unfolds in Kiev. He feels that it's very hard for him to explain to Petrograd what's happening in Kiev. It's very hard for them to explain to Petrograd what they want from Kiev. And you imagine, this is a military man, so he's got the most efficient communication between Petrograd and Kiev that you could want. Deciphered, unciphered, telegrams coming back and forth, couriers, and he cannot figure out what the hell is going on there and how they are screwing up things. And even he's not sympathetic with the Ukrainian national movement at some point, but he sees how many times mistakes were made between Petrograd and Kiev based on lack of information. And again, if anyone would have the best information available, it was someone in the military, you would think, who was in command. But he depicts in his memoirs how communication so broke down between Petrograd that with every day the revolutions were farther and farther apart. So that, coming back to Marshall's 16 in Central Asia is a different period when Central Asia starts getting separated off from the bigger part of the empire. So this sense of the breakup of the empire, and coming back to Eric's questioning of my entanglement thing, the disentangling of the empire, because of the breakdown of railroads and telegraphs and roads that connected it in the old way, and allowed these kind of experiments in local and regional alternatives, let's say, to have a life, at least for a few months or a few years in some cases, before some other forces came in into those experiments and options, or at least transformed in certain ways. So I think this is going to be a great one. Oh, maybe back to the other thing that I raised, which we tried to talk about, is in a volume that's dedicated to the war and kind of the inevitability of the war and the dynamics of the war. We leave out peace and anti-war, anti-militarism, which were, again, not just in Russia, but in Germany at various points, and England, very important movements which lost some of their steam once the war started, but they didn't lose completely, because we do have these moments where people from the belligerent countries, either at the official level, debating, negotiating about prisoner of war treatment, or about the Zimmerwald Conference is one example of many of international collaboration to end the war, or to talk about life after the war, which we're kind of missing here. And I think it makes us run the risk of being a little bit too militaristic in our overall impact here. If we don't kind of put that challenge in of what alternatives there were to pursuing the war. And there were several times that there were separate pieces talked about, almost from year one of the war. There were efforts to end this stupid thing, and it kept on going and going and going. But that wasn't the way it was supposed to be for a lot of people. And so I think I'd like to keep that as another aspect of the alternative history component of this, that I think these papers really open up in ways that I haven't seen such a collection of papers do anywhere else before. I think, yeah, I'll stop. It's probably the provocative.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your time. And now we open the general and final concluding discussion, so everyone is welcome to make comments about the entire course of the conference, or particular comments, as you wish. Yes, Ludmila?
I want to respond to one comment of Mark concerning the whites and white policy. I really have a feeling that that's something what is missing from this volume, and all of a sudden when I was listening to you, an idea struck me that we might have in our volume that piece that would just fill that gap. In particular, I don't know, maybe it's a wrong idea, but I think it could be a possibility. I mean the work by a German scholar who is now in Estonia, Karsten Bruggemann. He's studying the northwestern front of Udenish and Estonians. So his basic idea, he published a book on that. His basic idea is that the whites, or Estonians, wanted independence, but they were so much afraid of the red attacks that they supported Udenish and his attack on Petrograd. Udenish on his and the whites on their side, they didn't want to support Estonian independence, but they had to collaborate with them because they wanted to attack Petrograd. So just they were coming from different backgrounds, they had different ideas, but they collaborated for their own purposes, for their own needs. And in the end, the White Army collapsed, but as a result of that process that the White Army was based in Estonia for so long, Estonia gained its independence. It's just kind of small story, local story of that white policies and Estonian nationalism kind of collaborating for some time, and as a result, there was an independent Estonia that emerged. I don't know.
And actually, it's actually one of the few places that the Allies asked the Germans to stay in the Baltic.
Well, I mean, he just started. He's a great specialist on the Baltic states generally. His focus is Estonia, but maybe could be a kind of a missing piece of the puzzle that might enrich your volume. I have problems thinking how it will fit into our picture because it's so much in the kaleidoscope because it's so much about state formation rather than.
Are you then suggesting?
I think so. I cannot speak on behalf of the editors of our volume,
We got it.
but I just had a feeling that it might much better fit with your volume if you have.
What is his name again?
Sorry.
Carsten Bruggemann.
Carsten Bruggemann, G-G-E-M-A-N-N. Bruggemann, Carsten Bruggemann. He's professor in Stanford right now, professor of Estonian and European history.
We were discussing the points.
So, but I have to talk to the other editors of my volume. But,
at the end, I was going to say something. Just practice.
Yeah, on Mark's point about the anti-war and peace movements, it's an interesting question. There's this volume that was edited by Holger Affenbach called An Improbable War that I did the Russian chapter on, and this was mainly pre-war. Sort of his thesis was that actually most of the structural pressures in the years leading up to the war were for peace, and that the war has to be explained in sort of exceptional ways. My chapter and several other chapters actually disagreed with it. It's actually interesting why, because several of us said actually it was heading in the other direction. And so the piece, I'm not sure about. I had this, I did all this conscientious objector stuff in the first book, and those guys were not treated well, not by the state, but by fellow citizens over the course of the war. And, it's hard to see a strong peace sentiment. And yet, in 1917, you do get this move from at first not quite peace, but saying, can we get out of the war without annexations? And the anger at Milyukov that then transforms, and so that's an anti-imperial thing in a very significant way, right? I mean that people are asking in essence, is this a war about empire? And if so, we don't want to be a part of it. If this is a war for a nation, we're willing to be a part of it, in a certain way, is what that stance says, peace without annexations or indemnities. That's in essence what that slogan represents. And then, of course, by the end of the year, peace at any price. And so that would be an interesting paper to have about that rapid transformation. Not that there was a long history of a strong peace movement in Russia, and for the first 3 years of the war, virtually absent, and yet you get this rapid transformation in 1970. It would be, and on the issue of empire, precisely on the issue of empire.
What's the slogan of the war revolution? Peace and bread. And when it first decrees that Lenin is on peace with the belligerents, and then they go to Brest-Litovsk. And there was the same in the Ukrainian movement. One of the reasons that Rada was kind of positioned to go to Brest-Litovsk was because that had been the pressure from the Ukrainian national movement to end this war, so that we can get back to building a successful Ukraine. So peace forced a lot of people to do a lot of things. I mean, the peace movement, or the demand for peace, was very much part of the politics of the revolution. And Brest-Litovsk is also missing in general from this. It just occurred to me. And that's, the Brest-Litovsk settlement with Ukraine was actually very mild and very un-imperialist. They did ask for grain, but they respected the borders. They insisted that the Bolsheviks recognized them. The later treaty with the Bolsheviks was draconian and was held against them in Versailles. But the first treaty with Ukraine was not that way. I mean, it turned out otherwise, but it wasn't envisioned that way. So it's a kind of weird Brest-Litovsk interpretation too it could be deconstructed and revised.
Although, I mean, to do kind of counterfactual in a certain way, had the Tsarist government sued for peace, as it probably should have done in September 1915, and this is Vincennes offensive, let's say, that probably would have been deeply unpopular, even among the troops. In other words, the idea that they would have given up Brest-Litovsk, signed Brest-Litovsk in essence in 1915, I think probably would have been much more popular. So something, I think, has happened. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it would have been popular to have done it. I think I'm not.
But when we recall Brest-Litovsk, we shouldn't forget Tarpezun.
Forget what?
Tarpezun.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another forgotten dimension, which
The
is not.
church were in Brest-Litovsk too.
Well, that's right, but then the consequence of that, and the consequence of that is sometimes we, fall into the old story. just one word. I didn't. Other comments?
Okay, that's the practical.
Oh, the practice.
If we're not.
No. We introduced a division between substantive comments and the organizational comments of this one. This is an important procedure one. So I inform everyone that this is the last call to have substantive commentaries on what transpired. I just wanted to say it would make a lot. I mean, you raised this question of peace treaties that concluded the war. Now, one of the problems with looking at the war from the other end, that is not to use the expression the Eastern Front War, is that there, you would end up having several peace treaties, Brest-Litovsk, Trapezun, Batum, Trapezun negotiations, then Batum, then Riga. So it doesn't end up with one thing, because the space, the common political space, where the inter-imperial political space collapses, you have, as a result, a series of peace negotiations and peace treaties. This is one thing. The other thing is that we miss the idea that we have to have, a war ends up with a peace treaty, or doesn't end with that. But the thing we missed it because we have empire nationalism, and as a result, empire collapses, and there is no one kind of to conclude the peace treaty. So that's I'm kind of trying to reconstruct how we didn't miss it. But that is a great idea, together with the idea to look at the story of the publication of the secret protocols, the secret documents pertaining to the war. That I think was aired at one of the meetings, one of our general meetings, and I think it was even Boris who raised it at some point. That's what I recall.
The new book on the relatively new book on Versailles by Margaret, whatever her name is. She highlights this, that they couldn't include Russia in the Versailles talk because they didn't have any borders there, they didn't have any people they could agree to negotiate with. They tried negotiating with the Whites at one point, they tried negotiating with the Bolsheviks at another point, and none of that worked. So the Russian absence at the Versailles conference was fatal for the outcome. And she also talks about how Poland was a problem because Poland's boundaries were changing by the month too, as we know from Vera's take on the various Polish-Lithuanian war, Polish-Soviet war. Those borders of the east of Poland couldn't be resolved until Treaty of Riga sort of resolved. So that the Versailles settlement was incomplete almost before it started because of the Russian problem, the Russian absence, which everyone felt, but they didn't know what to do with it.
And since it will be 2019, but there's just one word, because this is what I wanted to ask Alexei. There is a book on Brest-Litovsk, Ukrainsky Brest-Litovsky Mir, by Mikhutin, which is a very peculiar book, which main thesis is it is because Ukrainians betrayed the Russian cause that the whole thing happened that way and not the other way that it was supposed to be to happen, and that is the only book after William Barrett.
Well, there's an employer, there's actually a Ukrainian one from Zelensky, who's 30s.
We can put this together.
Which is documents from Russian-Ukrainian negotiations under Hetman, which went on because the Brest-Litovsk Treaty left a lot of things unresolved too, that had to be negotiated further, like how much they were supposed to pay and how they were going to pay it. So they kept on negotiating with Skoropadsky, even though
Which I have
the Bolsheviks had to recognize Ukraine, according to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and that had to be worked out. And these two documents, which are called, I think, Российско-Украинские отношения, blah, 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 It's great documents from the continuation of Brest-Litovsk after it was signed.
About which I have a practical remark on that, Shada. I think when we think about the volume, we should ask contributors to have a further reading part, concluding their essays, which would list this kind of historiography, this kind of publications and scholarly tributes. I think it would be a great idea to ask if people would be willing to accommodate this. You see what I mean? The further conclusion chapter, the further reading on the topic, or
further reading on the topic. Well, we talked about asking people to focus more on the historiographical aspects of their problem and because like I say, so many of these pieces are revisionist in a kind of very nice way, but they're revisionist against something that's out there. And in order to help the reader appreciate how revisionist we are, I think more historiography, I mean, without becoming German about this, but some, in the footnotes at least, some sort of attention.
Yeah, I think rather than an annex at the end of each chapter, it should be most articles. I mean, generally, you start with your arguments and then a couple of big footnotes that situate your argument in the existing historiography. And that's what every journal requires, and that's what we should ask for as well. So, as things move in. But I just wanted to use this conversation about peace no, this is not substantive. This is substantive. Just use this discussion of peace to just mention a colleague of mine in Washington, Charles Kupchin, who just wrote a book about how wars end. And it's about compared many different case studies about peacemaking. And he I don't know if it's in his book or not, but he's mentioned to me several times that he did some sort of calculation, and it's something like 100 to 1 or even more, the number of books on the origins of wars versus the actual peacemaking. And yet, if you think about it, getting into the war is the easy part. Getting out is the hard part. As we know, as we're watching, do you sign a treaty with the Taliban? Do you sign with the... That's a more challenging and more complex and difficult question, and yet we study it much less, vastly less than we study the origins of war. So it's an extremely important point, and maybe 2019 is the time to think about that. All right, so let me just start by repeating thanks to Sasha for organizing all this and putting it all together. It's really quite an accomplishment, and we're extremely grateful. And thanks to everyone for coming and submitting such great papers. So here's the plan of work for the coming year. The editors are all going to provide comments and send them to me on each contribution. I'll gather them all together and send them to you, we hope, within 2 weeks. You're welcome to begin working on your papers and revising them as soon as you'd like, even before then. So that's the first thing. In about 2 weeks, you'll receive comments from all of us. There's another deadline then coming July 16. The general editors of all of these volumes, this 15-volume thing, are gathering for a big, long conference of editors in Madison, Wisconsin. And they will be dedicating a full day to discussing the papers. So many other editors and people are going to be reading these papers. And I'm not sure exactly what's going to come out of that, but I assume there will be even more comments. And you may or may not need this many comments on your papers, but just so you know that you put it on your calendars that even more comments may be coming. Fine, but I wouldn't let it go until once the new year's semester begins. Try to get it done this summer. The next stage after that is we will send then each paper out to an external reader, and there will then be another set of responses, or another response from that reader. The goal is then to have a final revised paper by the end of the year, and we'd like to submit it to the publisher in January or February of the coming year. So that's the schedule. So you can make your plans, mark your calendars accordingly, and hopefully get to work this summer and get it done. There are a couple things that I think we agree everyone will want to do. We already mentioned one, the idea of putting these articles in more standard article format with statement of the arguments, footnotes, putting that argument in the historiographical context, and then working in a conclusion. The second thing is, I think just about all of the contributions can do more to explicitly link the topic under discussion and more frequently link it to war, mobilization for war, whether it be the World War I itself or the Civil War, but to the fighting aspect, and of course then also to nationality and empire issues, although that's pretty much all of the contributions do that pretty well. So those are things, those are the general things. The more specific comments will be coming in a couple weeks. Any questions about this? We're done.
Thank you. And for the last part,
Yes.
well, the conference is officially closed, but the real closing will happen in the restaurant, to which participants will be taken by us, which will arrive at the gate at 7:30 p.m. And now it is time to walk, dance, something like this. So the bus, if you are leaving, like I say, unregistered, don't do it. Make sure we know if you're taking the bus or not, so that the bus is not waiting for people who are not taking. That's the idea. Thank you again. Thanks. So,
Сам себе режиссер, значит, да? У него есть проход. Да, конечно.
Не очень много, нам нужно внести этот комбик. То есть самые тяжелые вещи, нет комбик и стойка.
Окей. Так, сейчас я свой заберу, но я больше не
thanks again for coming. Bye-bye. Have a good trip back home.
Северность закинуть наверх. Хорошо. Ну ладно, сейчас и Надя позвонит. Давай. Надя, поезжай в ресторан. Куда направилась? А ты поезжай в ресторан вместо этого. Не хочешь? Ну ладно. Ну ладно, ладно. Давай. Ну что, экологическая активистка? Можешь мне дать багажник? Может, говорится. Вообще, да.
сам свою машину где-то утопил, что она там действительно стояла и пришел какой-то неизвестный пацан.
Нет, разговор был о 30, примерно 30 тысяч за всю эксплуатацию, ну, за всю работу.
С другой стороны, я не берусь, если существует слишком много систем. И вот это надо уточнить, я посчитала, что скорее всего это не имеет. У нас огромное количество охранных организаций в городе, которые занимаются тем, что у них есть, они предоставляют услуги по постоянному мониторингу.
Успенчик, когда мы пойдем в багажник ставить?
Сейчас пойдем.
А эти вещи ты хочешь тут держать? Или сходить за ключиком тебе, чтобы к Борисовичу их определить?
Ну, подержим сегодня тут. Борисович 14-го сам приедет.
Хорошо. А камеру ты же соберешь в сумочку и на стеллаж определишь ее?
Камеру соберу в сумочку.
Ну ладно, я пойду тогда схожу в копировалку, откину там сиськи.
Камера что-то плохо себя ведет.
Чего?
Камера что-то не выключается.
Это я выключил.